Welcome everybody. We're going to let people get settled and let everybody get connected, and then we'll get going in a couple of minutes. In the meantime, you see the information on your screen of the foundation and how to contact us. So if you wish to take a screenshot, be my guest. We are a large group today, so we're going to keep you muted, and we're going to ask that questions be given in the chat window. So let's get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Olivia Mattis. I'm president and co-founder of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. I hope everybody's having a nice Sunday, and thank you for joining us. Today, we have a really extraordinary story. It's our first event of the month of June of 2020, obviously. And this month, we are marking 80 years since Aristide de Sousa Mendes did his action in June of 1940. And so there were all kinds of events that we had planned for the 80th anniversary. We had a film screening in Paris. We had an exhibition in Bordeaux that was planned. We had a big gala that was planned. We had a big trip called Journey on the Road to Freedom through France, Spain, and Portugal. All kinds of events that had to be canceled or postponed because of the pandemic that we're in now. So instead, we're doing these virtual programs, and so this is our way of staying in touch with people who are interested in this history. And it's sort of our gift to you, these wonderful uplifting program to help people learn about beautiful stories while we're in the situation we're in now. So before we get going, I want to tell you a little bit about our upcoming events. As it happens, throughout the month, this month of June, we are focusing on people who lived to be more than 100 years old. So today we're focusing on the incredible Ruth Gruber, photojournalist and author. Next week, we have the inspiring story of Nicholas Winton. We're showing the film Nikki's Family and having a discussion afterwards with Dr. Eva Fogelman, who is one of the world's experts on the altruistic personality and on Holocaust rescue. And she's going to be in conversation with Annette Insdorf, who is a leading film scholar and film critic and professor at Columbia University. So that's going to be a really wonderful event, and I do hope everyone will sign up for it. The following week is Father's Day. We're having a special Father's Day program. In that case, it's the story of a woman searching for her father who died when she was a little girl of 5. She grew up in Canada. Her name is Andrée Lotte. She's a professor in Montreal. She knew nothing about her father. She had just vague memories of him. And after her mother died, she discovered a green suitcase in her mother's basement that opened a whole Pandora's box, well, in a good way, of this amazing history on her father's side. So if anyone's interested in genealogy, that's a fascinating program, and I urge you to join us for that. So these events I just mentioned, next week and the week after, are free events. The week following is our fundraiser. And that's also going to be a really amazing event, I think. It's called The Power of Music. And that is an event that's going to focus on a woman named Alice Hertz Sommer. Alice Hertz Sommer was a concert pianist, and she was the world's oldest Holocaust survivor. She lived to be 110 years old. So we're showing a film about her. We're going to all watch it together. And that film is called The Lady in Number 6. And immediately after we watched that short documentary film, which won the Oscar in 2014, I think, for Best Short Documentary. So we're going to watch that together, and then it's going to be followed immediately by a musical response, a concert of a composer and pianist, Neely Bruce, and a couple of singers who are going to give a love letter to Alice in their musical response to the film. So it's going to be a very tender, very special event, and I urge all of you to join us for that. So now, today. So today we are speaking about Ruth Gruber, and it's my privilege to welcome our two special guests. So first, Patricia Kenner, do you want to wave to everybody and just say a little hello?
Hello.
And now Dr. Blanche Wiesen Cook, can you also wave to everybody and say a little hello?
I'm so profoundly moved to be with you. This is really fabulous. Thank you.
So let me introduce our two guests. So a film producer, Patricia Kenner, approached Ruth Gruber about telling her life story when Gruber was 97 years old. The film that we all watched went on to critical acclaim. She serves on the boards of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, the Defiant Requiem Foundation, a Self-Help Foundation Educational Alliance, Carnegie Mellon University, and the American Heart Association. And she is co-chair of the Community Initiative on Holocaust Survivors of the UJA. She's also the executive producer of a wonderful film that I urge everybody to see called Fiddler, A Miracle of Miracles. And this was playing in theaters last year, 2019. And I'm sure you can get it on streaming, or Patty can tell you how to get the film. Our other speaker, Dr. Blanche Wiesen Cook, is a distinguished professor of history and women's studies at the John Jay College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, CUNY. She was a close friend. Actually, both of our panelists today were close friends of Ruth Gruber, and Blanche interviewed Ruth on several occasions. She is the world's leading authority on Eleanor Roosevelt and is the author of her definitive 3-volume biography. So we're going to start with Patricia. So Patricia, why don't you take us away?
Hi. Well, I met Ruth Gruber about 25 years ago. I was looking for a speaker. I am the co-chair of the Spring Women's Luncheon at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and I needed a speaker. And someone asked if I knew Ruth Gruber. I didn't. I met her. She was this tiny little woman, and I was a little bit nervous because I had to fill a room with 400 or 500 women at the Pierre Hotel, and I was hoping Ruth could do it. I didn't know anything about her. We became friends. She spoke at the luncheon. She was absolutely unbelievable, inspirational. The tiny little Ruth turned into a giant when she spoke. We became close friends after that. So I'm not sure how many of you have seen the film yet and how many of you are planning to see it later. But Ruth has done the most amazing things in her life. So Ruth is the youngest PhD in the world. Ruth rescued 1,000 Holocaust survivors and brought them from Italy to a camp in Oswego, New York. Ruth was a special assistant to
Harold
Ickes, Secretary of the Interior in the cabinet of FDR. Ruth met Virginia Woolf. Ruth was friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. She was friends with David Ben Gurion. Ruth had an amazing life. So when she was 97 years old, I turned to her and said, "You are the most amazing woman of this century. May I make a documentary on your life?" Now, the really interesting part about this, as phenomenal as Ruth is, the backstory is that where did I, a New York City businesswoman, have the nerve, the chutzpah to think, or the confidence that I could make a documentary film? I didn't think twice about it. Whenever Ruth needed to do something, she just did it. If 1,000 people had to be rescued, she did it. if she had to do her doctorate in a year, she did it. So the story of this film is that a group of people made it who didn't know anything about making a film, but were so inspired by Ruth that we just went ahead and did it. So she said I could do it. I went to my friend Doris Schechter, whom Ruth had introduced me to. Doris Schechter was brought to America by Ruth on the Henry Gibbons, one of the stories in the movie. And Doris, I told Doris I wanted to make a film on Ruth. I said, do you want to join me? She said, of course. I said, do you know how to make a film? She said, no. I said, you know any producers? She said, yes. I know a wonderful woman named Ziva Oldbaum who made a film about a twin brother and sister who were experimented on by Mengele, and it was done beautifully. It was called Renee and I loved the film. It was very beautiful. We asked Ziva, she adored Ruth, wanted to make the film. You know who else can help you do the film? Yes, I have an editor named Sabine Crayenbuhl. She had done something I loved. And she said, I have a friend who's a cinematographer named Bob Richmond. Now, he was a cinematographer for An Inconvenient Truth and for My Architect, the story of Louis Kahn, whose son made a documentary about him so he could get to know his father better. I love those two documentaries. She said he has never directed a film before, but I have full confidence that he could do it. I said, okay, Ziva, we're ready to go. I said, the one stipulation is that Ruth is 97 years old already. This film has to be done within 1 year. She said, what? Number one, it takes a long time to raise money for a film. That's why films usually take so long. And she said, can you guarantee that you'll have the money? I said, yes, I put aside the money. This is something that's very, very important to me. So although I am going to go out and fundraise for this movie, I have put aside the money that we need for the movie. So the barriers were down. We were incredibly lucky because Ruth had one room in her apartment where she kept all her records. And she was a fabulous record keeper. As a journalist, she kept meticulous notes, all in order. So Ziva was able to go in there. So we had a fabulous team ready to go. I had my friend Doris, another friend Denise. So a group basically was these three women who were making a film. When I went for fundraising, people would say to me, you know, the three of you, you don't really know how to make a film. So I had 100 friends help support this film. You will see at the end of the film, I always think it's really important to look and see all the wonderful people who support filmmakers. People gave me between $25 and two friends gave me $100,000. And I paid for the rest of it myself because I knew how important it was. So how do you make a film? They rent this room and they get a pegboard and they start with 3x5 cards. And of course we went to Ruth and said, what do you want this film to look like? What are the most important parts of your life? She said, her family, her education, going to Germany to get her PhD in Cologne, attending a rally with Adolf Hitler, then working for the Herald Tribune, going to the Soviet Arctic, going to Alaska for Ickes, bringing the 1,000 refugees back on the Henry Gibbons to a camp in Oswego, New York, and Exodus. So they put up on their pegboard 3x5 cards with these headings, and that's how we made the movie. So in 2009, we opened at the Toronto International Film Festival. These women were making this film Now, we were brilliant enough to get a fabulous team, but we didn't know how to make a film. So the fact that we opened at the Toronto International Film Festival, won 7 Best Documentary Awards in film festivals, we travel around. We have been traveling for 11 years. Here it is 11 years later, and Sousa Mendez Foundation says, we would like to show your film. So it's absolutely a film for all seasons, for all time. Students are inspired by it. We have shown the film to bar mitzvah classes, 13-year-old kids who've asked Ruth brilliant questions. Were you ever scared in any of the things you did? And Ruth gave fabulous answers to these children. I've gone to universities where I've talked to women's studies groups. And at the end of one of the talks, a girl screams, "Yes, you've inspired me. I can get through this year now. I'm gonna be like Ruth Gruber." She's totally inspirational. So it was such an honor to do this. We wanted Ruth to be known. And now I would like to turn it over to Ruth's friend and mine, Blanche Wiesen Cook.
Patty, that was marvelous. Your film is marvelous. It is such a blessing to have this film. I don't want to sound like a pedant, but I want to urge everybody who sees this film to read Ruth's books because they are so powerful. She was an inspiration in her life, and every word she wrote is brilliant, incisive, inspirational. And as an educator, I love several specific facts. How did Ruth get that way? Well, in Ahead of Time, her great memoir, the first volume of her memoir, she credits 2 teachers, both of them African American. The first teacher was her first grade teacher at PS 141. And her first grade teacher at PS 141 read poetry so beautifully that Ruth fell in love with words. And she credits this teacher with her love for words, and words are her primary source of power. Not only that, this teacher recognized that Ruth was a bit exceptional. And this teacher went to her home to tell her parents, you must take very good care of Ruth because she is going to be a great writer. That was Ruth's first inspiration. Her second inspiration, who she names, is her history teacher at Bushwick High School. And her history teacher at Bushwick High School was also an African American teacher, a man of great power and love, who also recognized that Ruth was extraordinary. And what Ruth says about Dr. Huggins, Huggins, is that he inspired her and informed how she understands history. History begins for Ruth Gruber with slavery and with pogroms. And the goal of those of us who study history is to fight for peace, to struggle for justice, and end the scourge of slavery and pogroms. Not only was Dr. Huggins her mentor, but like her first grade teacher, he went to her home too, to say to her family, I would like to take Ruth to the theater. And every weekend, he took Ruth to matinees in the theater. And she describes how she felt at the age of, she had skipped several grades by this time, and she was only 13. So here she is, this young 13-year-old girl with this giant man, black man, walking through the streets, not quite arm in arm, but virtually. And that's Ruth's origins, the power of Ruth's vision. And then we get to her incredible, I mean, she graduates from NYU, she goes to Wisconsin and gets a master's, and she has this fellowship to Cologne. It's a year's fellowship. And she has a mentor there who says, I want you to do a dissertation and get a PhD. And she says, I can't do that in a year, and I only have a year's fellowship. He says, well, try. I want you to study Virginia Woolf. And she does. And words are the most important thing for Ruth Gruber, but it's Virginia Woolf's words, the poetry and the rhythm of her language that inspires Ruth. And she concludes ahead of time with an extraordinary paragraph about how she sees the world. This amazing photojournalist who did the most amazing things. And as you said, everybody needs to deal with her conquest of, the Soviet Arctic and her traipsing through the various communities in Alaska, the Inuit communities where she learned to live inside of time because she just had to wait for so much. So she had to just have no schedule, think about the people around her, and think about the direction of her heart, and lead with her heart as she takes pictures and writes words. And Edward Steichen, the great photographer, advised her, think with your heart. Take pictures with your heart. She wrote the last paragraph in ahead of time, and I wrote with my heart, to think and speak with my heart, to be adventurous, to be an activist, to be a rebel, to be compassionate, and most of all, to be a mensch, a decent human being. In the beginning was the Word. I loved words. I loved writing and speaking with a passion. And for the rest of my life, I would go on doing both and never ask for special treatment as a woman, but I would always see as a woman, feel as a woman, and write as a woman, the words she got from Virginia Woolf. And her entire life and her legacy and her gift to those of us who knew her and loved her was that every word she wrote, every word she spoke, every day she lived was a day filled with joy and love and passion for life, for justice. We all were so lucky, and you all are so lucky to have her words and this film. Thank you, Patty. But I urge everybody to read Haven, to read Exodus, to read Ahead of Time and Inside of Time. Her words really on every page are magisterial. And I want to say one other word about her life as a journalist, because we both had the same publisher as journalists, Helen Rogers Reed. At one point, I had a syndicated column because Helen Rogers Reed said, as she said to Ruth Gruber in the 1940s, she said again in the 1960s, there just aren't enough women journalists. We have to have more syndicated columns by women. And I was lucky enough to be one of the people in One Woman's Voice. and had that syndicated column. And it was Helen Rogers Reed, who every time Ruth wrote something, Helen Rogers Reed, long before she met her, she really adored the power of her words. And Helen Rogers Reed, who was also a visionary, really promoted Ruth Gruber's work, as did the amazing curmudgeon Harold Ickes. And Ruth Gruber's life in the administration, and as you know, Ickes was not just Secretary of the Interior, he was also in charge of oil and natural resources, and his sending Ruth to what we call the Middle East, and Ruth's observations about the tyranny of Britain, both in the Middle East and specifically in Palestine. I mean, there's nobody else who could have done it with as tremendous a vision and commitment for justice as Ruth Gruber. And her words are so, so powerful. So perhaps we've gone long enough individually, and maybe there are some questions, but I'm just so grateful for this opportunity to celebrate Ruth Gruber, our mentor, our healer, our guide.
So at this point, I would like to invite people to start putting their questions into the chat window. And in the meantime, perhaps Blanche and Patty, there are questions you would like to ask one another. I'd love to have you in dialogue together.
Okay, Blanche, maybe you could tell us a little bit about her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt. I know they did so many things together when they got the terrible report, when FDR got a terrible report from Morgenthau called acquiescence.
This is very late. And one of the great tragedies, which I write about a bit in both volume 2 and volume 3. In volume 2, which I wrote Curled in Agony, I have a chapter called A Silence Beyond Repair. FDR did nothing to protect any of the refugees. And at this moment, with the onslaught of refugees all over the planet, it is incredible to read Ahead of Time and Inside of Time and Ruth's work for the refugees, Haven and Exodus. In 1944, it's very late, Henry Morgenthau is Secretary of the Treasury, and his staff puts in a report, the American acquiescence in the slaughter of the Jews.
Of the US government.
Right, the US government, the US acquiescence. And that results in the Emergency Rescue Committee. It results in, for the first time, some real effort to protect some refugees, which results in Haven. The 1,000, finally, there'll be one area in Oswego, one camp. And Eleanor Roosevelt and Eleanor Morgenthau visit Oswego. Eleanor Roosevelt really supports all of Ruth's work. But let me just say that Varian Fry and the Emergency Rescue Committee, Eleanor Roosevelt supported that as well. The State Department stopped it. FDR never removed this really, Eleanor Roosevelt said, you know, he's a fascist, Breckinridge Long. And FDR said, Eleanor, don't use that word. Well, maybe I shouldn't use that word, but he is a fascist. But here we are, he's in charge of every aspect of the State Department. And very little happens to protect refugees. And then one goes beyond when FDR dies in April 12, 1945, he's replaced by Truman, Harry Truman. And it's Ruth Gruber and Eleanor Roosevelt together who persuade Truman that the refugees who are living in Oswego must not be returned to Europe, even though there's a great movement to have them removed again. And finally, Truman acquiesces. And it's really Ruth Gruber and Ickes and Eleanor Roosevelt who have persuaded Truman that they can stay. Then there are the DP camps, and Ruth visits the DP camps all over Europe. And the most astonishing thing is the reports about the DP camps. They are like German camps, except they're not being killed. They are unsanitary, they are horrible. People are living in hideous circumstances all over Europe. And what is going to happen to the displaced persons, as they are called? And again, it's Eleanor Roosevelt and Ruth Gruber who are working together to make something better happen. It is really just an entirely disgusting reality that goes on for a very long time.
We do have a very interesting question that has come in having to do with the New York Times coverage of the Holocaust. There was a book by Laurel Leff called Buried by the Times about the New York Times coverage or lack of coverage of what was going on in Europe. So the question for either of you, I'm not sure which, maybe for you, Blanche, is what would Ruth Gruber have made of that book, and what was her impression of whether what was going on was being adequately covered?
Well, she knew it wasn't being adequately covered. She knew there was a silence imposed. And, you know, the Herald Tribune reported more on Barry and Fry than the New York Times by far. So it was, again, Helen Rogers Reed who broke the silence to some extent, but the Times really was silent. Despite the fact that it was owned by Sulzberger and so on. And there's just, it's a hideous, ongoing hideous story. I think Ruth would be grateful the book was finally published. She and Ickes and Eleanor Roosevelt tried to break the silence and they failed. Ruth really defended, let me just say she didn't defend FDR's silence, but she did explain it by the political facts, how anti-Semitic the people in power throughout the United States in fact were. The fact is the Democratic Party at the time was the Dixiecrat Party, dominated. You know, there were poll taxes and literacy tests. Who voted? And the electorate was limited, and the Dixiecrats were in power, so that FDR was a juggler. And he liked to say, I never let my right hand know what my left hand is doing. He was that good a juggler.
So
I just want to add one thing. You will note in the movie that Ruth makes a very strong point about this. She says that FDR knew, Ruth says America was clearly anti-Semitic. All of America was anti-Semitic at the time, and FDR knew that he was walking a very thin line. Although Blanche said Ruth didn't defend him, she tried to explain him, but I always thought she was overly kind to him in her explanations. I couldn't understand that. But she said, Ruth said, and you will see this in the movie, Ruth says, Roosevelt said they called him Rosenfeld. They said they called the New Deal the Jew Deal, and they said that he was fighting the war for the Jews. Then Ruth went on to talk about Father Coughlin, who went on the air. The biggest anti-Semite minister went on the air every week.
Nationally.
Horrible things about the Jews to thousands of people. So there is a part in the film about that, you will notice.
So there's a question about where the film leaves off. The film leaves off in 1947 with the Exodus story. And of course, there were many years between 1947 and her death in 2016. So how did she spend those years? What did she do post-World War II, post-State of Israel?
Ruth did so many things. I always ask after a talk, who's going to make the next movie? Ruth went on to, after the State of Israel was established, Ruth was friends with DAVID Ben Gurion, and he allowed her very early on to bring Ethiopians to Israel. She was very, very involved until a year or two before her death. She was busy. I would call her and ask her to do something, and she would say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm being interviewed today for a film on the Nuremberg trials." There were so many people who were always, there aren't that many people alive anymore who sat in the front row of the Nuremberg trials. So she kept so busy writing. As Blanche said, when she was 95, she wrote Witness. She was very, very active. Blanche, you want to add?
She was really miraculously active. She went to what we call the Middle East many, many times. Her report of the poverty of Egypt and Iraq are unbelievable. Again, folks need to read Inside of Time and her books to read what she exposed as a journalist, as a writer. She just never slowed down. She did incredible work and kept at it. I interviewed her 3 times for my program, Jewish Women in America, for CUNY TV. And I don't know if those CUNY TV interviews are online yet, but I will put them on my website this year. Twice in 2003 and once in 2007, when she had written another book in 2007. So it's really, she was amazing. And as I said earlier, every single word was inspirational and powerful and important. So I hope everybody will read her books. And Patty, you said who's going to do the next film? Who's going to write Ruth's biography?
You.
No. You. Maybe we should do it together. Okay. It's a day.
And also, she was very involved in the making of the movie. So she was 97 and 98 years old, traveling to Israel, interviewing Ike Aronovitz, who was the captain of the Exodus. She was, you can see her in her elderly years in the movie. So that's part of the answer to this question. You could see how active she was even in her late 90s.
So there are a few more questions. One is, when did Ruth Gruber first become aware of the extermination camps?
Let me say, they weren't originally extermination camps, but they were camps really very early on. And when Ruth is back, first of all, in 1931, everybody has to read ahead of time. And her years in Cologne, she describes how Hitler came to power in 31, 32, when she is in Cologne, when she's in Germany, when she's in Berlin, and the astonishing similarities to the creature in the White House and Hitler coming to power, as Ruth describes Hitler's support network and Hitler's coming to power. It is absolutely chilling. And then She has, in 1935, people are being removed. She's with her friends in Germany, the Herzes, and she's in their home. Out the window, she sees people being removed, old people being removed from their homes and taken into, removed, and they're going to camps. And she knows that early, 35, 36, the camps are open and people are being taken to them. So folks knew about the camps really in the middle 30s, before the war. The death camps, the systematic extermination doesn't happen until later, but the camps and the death at the camps happen early and go on.
So there are a few more questions. So one is from a filmmaker who is on the call, who wants to know how much more footage there is that didn't get used.
I think there's a lot of footage. Is that Laura? But anyway, there's a lot more.
And not only that, when you think about her witness, 192 photographs are in that book, and there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds more that, you know, didn't make it to that book. We know they're there.
Right, her family put her archives at NYU, and I know the stipulation is people are allowed to see them. They're not
closed.
They're
They're
not
open.
closed. They're available for anyone who wanted to go through them. Both photo and, you know, we were talking about her as a photojournalist and as a photographer. And Blanche quoted Edward Steichen. Ruth never took one photography course in her life. Her photography class was Steichen saying, take pictures with your heart. And that is Ruth's only training in photography. The International Center for Photography did an exhibit in their whole museum on Ruth Gruber's photographs. To this day, we still have it traveling around the world. It's been in Skokie, Illinois. It's been at the University of Michigan. It's going to University of Wisconsin, where Ruth got her master's. It will be going to the Wiener Library for Holocaust Studies in England next year. We're in a difficult position at the moment because of the pandemic. So
When
we're
is it
home.
going? Oh, maybe when we're there.
But
When is it going to London?
it's going to London next year. We had a date, but we're not sure when it will be definite because of this pandemic. So Ruth's photographs are traveling constantly, and we love when they're at colleges. I then go and show the movie. We had them at Brooklyn College because that was Ruth's undergraduate school. So we had the exhibit there and the film.
So there's a question about her family, because the film doesn't really get into her family, except to say that there was the conversation between her editor and her husband-to-be about how we don't change our names around here, that kind of thing. But so viewers who watched the film had to wait until the very end, until the credits, to actually see images of Ruth's family. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about them, about her husband, about her children.
Well, Ruth almost had it all. Ruth was 40 years old when she got married. She had 2 children. She then, each one of her children had 2 children, so she had 4 grandchildren. She had it all. Her mother was very helpful when Ruth had to travel and go on assignments. Obviously, she married the most incredible men. Her first husband was Philip Michael, and she had a child.
Can I just say a word about Philip Michaels? Because
Yes.
he was a great social worker in the manner of Jane Addams and Lillian Wald. His goal was to end poverty. His goal was to help people who were down and out and suffering. And he really was this incredibly wonderful, generous activist.
And
then
supportive.
And very supportive of Ruth's work, of course. So, but he's really, again, an article or a book needs to be done about Philip Michaels. And then the two children are totally fabulous. So you want to say a word, Patty?
Right. First, I want to tell how she and Phil met. Ruth was friends with Munoz Marin, who was the first governor of Puerto Rico, the first democratically elected governor. Ruth was friends with him and was invited to Puerto Rico to the inauguration. The governor says, Ruth, come over here. I want you to meet someone.
You two New Yorkers should meet.
Ruth's hand on Phil Michaels' hand and said, the two of you have to meet. So Ruth says, I didn't ask him up to see my etchings, but I did ask him to come and travel around the island of Puerto Rico with me. She said, because I was on assignment for the paper covering this inauguration, I had a car and driver. I took him to the slums of Puerto Rico, and he was so moved that I fell in love with him. She said he was the most wonderful person. Unfortunately, he died early. She met another wonderful man, Henry Rosner, another supportive person. You can imagine how these men had to be fabulous supporting Ruth traveling around the world. And she had her two children. And when the kids used to travel around with us, Celia would say we had the most interesting childhood. We would have dinner with world leaders, and it was so exciting. We didn't really feel that we didn't have a mother with us a lot. We had so many additional advantages. And so her children end up, her daughter Celia lives in London. She was she worked for the BBC, and her son David was the head of OSHA under Obama in Obama's cabinet. So these kids did not fall far from Ruth. They were very close to Ruth, and the grandchildren, Ruth would say, when we traveled around with Ruth showing the film, she would say, I have just 4 normal Jewish genius grandchildren.
Let me just say one thing about her son and OSHA. He's written several really important books about the environment, and they are so really for this moment. So her legacy lives in her words and in her children's words. It's really so powerful.
So we have a question about Ruth Gruber and FDR. Did she never criticize him?
To the best of my knowledge, she did not.
I feel I would agree with that. She defended him, felt he could do more, but defended him because the whole country was terribly anti-Semitic.
Next, there's a question as to whether Ruth knew the German filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl.
I have no evidence that she did.
I don't either.
Now there's a question about the film. There's a scene in the film where she talks about getting her revenge on that man who wouldn't let her go to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
But it wasn't fully clear what her revenge was. Can you tell that story?
Yes. So that story, I objected to that in the film. I thought it wasn't clear enough. What they did was show you the article telling the story, but I don't think they left it the camera on the story long enough. So this horrible John Singleton, they called him the hanging judge from Ireland, told Ruth she could not go, even after she had gone to Baghdad and gotten a visa to visit. And Ruth wrote an article saying John Singleton did not allow Ruth Gruber, a journalist from the United States, to go on the plane. So she really embarrassed him terribly.
And it was a US plane.
Yes, and that's what Ruth says afterwards. She said, oh, I found out afterwards that it was a United States plane. Had I known, I definitely would have insisted. But she did say in the film, I was 33, I was very polite then, but I should have let him throw me off the plane.
So there's a question about the very tender conversation between Ruth Gruber and the great granddaughter of the publisher. So is there anything more you can tell us about that relationship between Ruth and that young lady? How did that all come about?
I know. Do you, Blanche?
I don't, which publisher are you talking about?
This is Helen Reed's granddaughter was going to Barnard and she was doing her thesis on her grandmother. So she went and interviewed Ruth. That was just a short-lived interview between us. They had no relationship. They weren't friends or anything.
But Ruth told her that, you know, she was like a surrogate daughter to Helen Rogers Reed.
Oh,
and that really meant a lot to her granddaughter, that her grandmother supported women in journalism and she could be a journalist too. That meant a lot to her granddaughter.
Right. The question was the girl friends with Ruth?
Oh.
And the answer is absolutely not. It was a one-time or short-lived interview telling how fabulous the grandmother was.
Right.
So we have about 10 minutes left. So there's time if people would like to ask some more questions. But in the meantime, I'm wondering if each of our special guests can speak about the importance of Ruth and her life to the period we're living in today, if there are lessons from Ruth's life that we can apply today.
There's one more thing I want to say about the movie, a question that most people have. So for those of you who have seen the movie, you may remember Ike, the captain, the real captain of the Exodus. Ruth goes to Israel. She's in his apartment. He's very flirtatious with her. He puts his hand on her leg. It's absolutely a riot. But they're arguing. Ruth says, this is so beautiful. And he says, what little is left of it, we only have 12% left. Maybe you'd like to give that back. So they kept bantering about land in Israel. Now, Ike was a member of the Likud party. And the Likud party believes you don't give up 1 inch of your land. Ruth was a follower and friend of David Ben Gurion, who wanted peace. So Ruth was okay with giving up land. Peace was the ultimate goal. So you will notice, if you haven't seen the movie yet, or if you remember the bantering that went on, oh, you want to give up more, you want to give them back more. That's what they were arguing about.
Let me just say one thing. Divide Palestine and let the people grow. Ruth's goal was peace. There wouldn't be hope for the entire Middle East until there was peace. And her goal was to figure out some way that we can agree on so we don't have to kill each other, to have a divided territory and let the people grow. That was her motto. And it's, you know, I think that's one of her most important legacies. And if we look at refugees at this moment, her other most important and timely legacy is, how do we open our hearts and open our country? I mean, it's not like we don't have room for people, for the refugees. Why should they be dying of needless diseases, and starvation when we can open the harbors and let the people in. So that's what Ruth, that was her vision, and that's her legacy.
And Ruth,
No boundaries, no borders, no walls. And, you know, she didn't go as far as Wendell Willkie and Eleanor Roosevelt, one world, but, you know, she was impressed with Wendell Willkie when he went around the world in 1940, I'm sorry, 1942, wrote One World, everything that happens, and we can see this in the pandemic most clearly, everything that happens anywhere affects everybody everywhere. We are all united, one world. And that ultimately was Ruth's vision.
and at the end of her life, she knew that Donald Trump was running against Hillary Clinton, and her daughter Celia took her into the voting booth and she voted for Hillary. Now, we don't know in our hearts if she knew what was going to happen, but she was very sad when Donald Trump was the opponent to Hillary, and she adored Hillary. I have a photograph of Ruth when she was 103. That is quite beautiful. Can you see this?
Yes.
Is this the right?
You did it. Yes, yes.
And at the end of Ruth's talks, she would always say, and when she wasn't with us, I would say it, each one of us has our special gifts. She said, my gifts are my camera and my words. And with those gifts, I try to do the best that I can. And every single one of you, she would say, everywhere she went, has your special gifts. And you have to look inside yourself, find those special gifts, and use them to make peace and to make the world a better place. And that was her message. Make the world better than you found it. Do as much as you can. She inspired all of us. She inspired me, a businesswoman who runs a bus company in New York, to have the nerve to think I could make a movie about this wonderful woman. But whenever something needed to be done, Ruth Gruber got up and did it. Take advantage of every opportunity. And that's the lesson she wants people to have.
Blanche, any last words from you? And then,
well, courage can be as contagious as fear. Always go forward. Courage can be as contagious as fear. Blessed be Ruth Gruber.
Great. So I would like to thank both of our speakers today for this very lively conversation. And of course, thank you to everyone who gave up part of their Sunday to watch this film and to spend time listening to the conversation. So I do hope you will sign up for our upcoming events. And I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.